Last week we began the discussion of the productivist program, which is the very heart of a progressive alternative to institutionally conservative social democracy. And I suggested that such a program has three main themes or focal points. The first is the relation of the advanced part of production to the backward parts, and therefore as well the path from a knowledge economy for the few to a knowledge economy for the many. And the other two were to be discussed today. The relation of labor to capital, the future of work, and in particular the future of free work, and the relation of finance to the real economy, to the productive agenda of society. I ended class last week with some remarks about the problem of agency. How the program of an inclusive knowledge economy and inclusive vanguardism meets up with the real world of class or group interest and social forces. And in reality, what I have to say about this problem of agency, applies to all three parts of this productivist program, to the part about labor and to the part about finance, as well as to the part about the advanced sector of production. And so I want to invert the order today and begin by returning to the discussion of agency and developing it, having in mind now that these ideas I think are applicable to all parts of the productivist program. Now, let me begin by restating what I think are two central ideas of the view of agency which informs my discussion. And they can be summarized in two theses: the correspondence thesis and the duality thesis. What I mean by the correspondence thesis is that every programmatic proposal can be alternatively stated as a series of innovations in the structure, in the regime, in the institutional framework, particularly the institutional framework of the economy and of power or politics. And it can also be stated as the proposal for a coalition of social and political alliances that can support it. The definition of a constituency, an intended constituency. I don't think of these two versions of a programmatic agenda as sequentially related. It's not as if we first formulate the institutional ideas and then we think what kind of coalition would be necessary and possible to support it. They're really two sides of the same thing. It's the coalition, the alliances, are not a kind of afterthought that we come to after we have formulated the programmatic ideas. They're an alternative register in which to formulate the same programmatic ideas. That's the correspondence thesis. And the duality thesis is the idea that every group or class interest can be defined and defended in more than one way. And in particular, the idea that there are two main families of ways in which any class or group interest can be defined and defended. There is always a way that is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive, and another way that is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic or inclusive. And I illustrate this by looking at one of the three main components in a progressive coalition that would be capable of supporting a program such as the one that I'm outlining. And that is the traditional historical base of institutionally conservative social democracy, of the left-leaning parties and forces in the advanced society, the organized labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, and especially in conventional industry. So these workers and their leaders, or their political representatives, could always consider their interests in two ways. On the one hand, they could think that their interest is to dig into their present niche in the technical division of labor. That is, to defend conventional industry as it now exists, as it is now established, against all the threats to its continuation. And with that institutionally conservative approach goes as well a socially exclusive idea, namely the tendency to view the groups that are closest in social and economic space to them, to these workers, as the enemies. And that would include, typically in these societies, the small business class, the temporary workers, the foreign workers, and so forth. Alternatively, the workers could see their interest in a fashion that is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic or inclusive. They would think this form of industry, this form of production, has no future. We can generate defensive measures, such as restraints on outsourcing or plant closing, or protectionism in foreign trade that could buy us a few more years. But this kind of industry is not coming back to life. All we can do is prolong its existence for a while. And that would then lead them to the idea that the future lies in converting this present form of industry into its successor, a version of the knowledge economy. And in that project, which necessarily requires the engagement or the assistance of the state, of the government, they need a broader set of alliances. This more inclusive knowledge economy would have to serve many of those same groups that they define as their rivals or their enemies. They instead would have to become their allies. And that's what I mean by arguing that characteristically the institutionally transformative approaches are also socially inclusive or solidaristic. Now, of course, the socially exclusive and institutionally conservative approaches, pursuing this example, are the ones that have on their side tangibility. They're what exists. And they seem to minimize risk. But they have a great disadvantage. They represent what in earlier classes I call the path of least resistance. The downsizing of this innovation, in this case, the whole combination of innovations that we associate with the insular knowledge economy that exists today, to the constraints imposed by the present order. And that downsizing, almost by definition, implies that the full potential of the innovations for society will not be achieved. And so that gap between the achievement and the potential is what the enemies of the path of least resistance have on their side. That's what they have to play with in the struggle against the path of least resistance. So there's the example of this contrast as applied to the first component in the coalition that could support these progressive alternatives in political economy. But I think that there are two other components that I began to explore last week that deserve more extensive treatment and that are relatively more important than this faction that I've just described, the traditional organized labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive parts of production. The first of these other groups is some faction of the national elite, of the moneyed classes, of the people who have the greatest access to power and wealth. And what is required for this part of the coalition is that there be some conflict, some rupture, some contradiction between parts of the elite. And part of the elite has to identify itself with a productivist strategy, a strategy of increasing, of expanding growth, of socially inclusive economic growth, and of the rise of productivity. So let me step back a moment to consider the larger world historical context of these remarks. Every so-called growth miracle in modern history seems to have involved the combination of two elements. Part of the elite has embraced a productivist idea, an idea of how to increase wealth, but that idea then has been associated with a national interest in prosperity and empowerment, in increasing the wealth and power of the country. And it is in the name of this national idea that that faction of the elite has then appealed beyond the elite to a larger part of society. So there is a conflict between, let's call them the productivists and the rentiers, the value creators and the rent seekers within the elite. And this conflict is then associated with a national project. Now, the national project is not something restricted to now, to the 20th century, to the 21st century. I gave the example of the Hamiltonian project in the United States at the time of the foundation of the Republic, a national developmental agenda, the movement on top, which I said interacted with the, and below, with the selective democratization of the economy in the then two crucial sectors of agriculture and finance. So this observation then of the recipe for growth miracles, that growth miracles typically involve the sum of productivism and nationalism, beginning in the elite and then appealing beyond it, then prompts a reflection on the character of contemporary nationalism, which I formulated much earlier in the course in a different way. And here's the reflection. The nations of the world used to be like most of them, many of them, or most of them, like tribes, based on some kind of quasi-biological affinity, some consanguinity, so a similarity of culture, of religion, rooted in common descent, and they even look like one another. And that's what the nations of the world used to be. And now it seems they're on some kind of voyage toward becoming something else. And what at the limit they would become if they continued this voyage is moral experiments in different ways of being human. Society has no single natural and necessary form. There's no natural way of organizing society. and each organization of society, contrary to the central premise of classical liberal political theory, discourages some forms of experience and encourages the development of others. So each is the choice to develop our humanity under the protective shield of the state, of its law, and of its monopoly of violence in a particular direction. But along the way of this trip from the tribe to a form of moral specialization within humanity, which is what, at the limit, the nations would become if they continue to travel in this direction, an accident happens. And this accident is the key to the understanding of the peculiar dangers and perversions of contemporary nationalism. There's a worldwide competition and a reciprocal emulation that is both practical and spiritual. And the nations of the world are vying with one another for wealth, power, and spiritual authority. And in this process of worldwide emulation and competition, they must sacrifice part of what they used to be in order to succeed, to prosper, to flourish, to be powerful. The paradigmatic example that I gave was the Meiji Restoration in Japan in the middle of the 19th century. So part of the Japanese elite seizes power in the name of an idea that satisfies its own interest but is also intended to address the interests of the nation, and says, we must sacrifice some of our traditional ways, and we must import practices and institutions from other parts of the world necessary to sustain the functional advantages of power, prosperity, and spiritual authority that we desire, that we seek. So we must come to the altar of this worldwide competition, and we must tear out part of ourselves, we must give it up, we must sacrifice some of our pre-existing collective identity for the sake of practical success, of worldly success in this global competition and struggle. So that already involves a significant change in the character of the collective identity. When the nations of the world were just tribes, their collective identity consisted in their ancient ways of doing things, in their customs. That's what it meant to be a Roman, an ancient Roman. It meant living according to the customs of the ancient Romans. But now, to some extent, these tangible collective identities must be hollowed out, because some of them has to be some of it has to be sacrificed, abdicated for the sake of this worldwide competition. And that's what I mean by the hollowing out. But as it is hollowed out, the desire for difference, rather than being quieted, is aroused and inflamed. The nations of the world want to be different, even though the basis on which they signified, they described their difference, has now weakened or at least changed. Some part of the tangible collective customs which define the collective identity has to be given up for the sake of success in this worldwide emulation. And so at the limit, this happens in the world, which describes, in the form of a caricature of an exaggeration, the peculiarly poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. Two nations live side by side, and they come to hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike, and because they want to be different. So it is the will to difference which is the source of the animosity, and not the possession of the actual difference. the more eviscerated or hollowed out the tangible collective identities become, the less they are susceptible to compromise, to recombination, to mixture. A tangible collective identity expressed in customs, in customary practices, is always porous. Its limits are not clear. They're not defined doctrinally. They're not a theory or the expression of a theory. They're a way of living. And the porous, tangible character of a way of living is always susceptible to compromise and recombination. But insofar, to the extent that a collective identity is hollowed out in the way that I've just described, it becomes not susceptible to compromise. There's nothing to compromise because the will to difference is in principle abstract. It has no tangible expression in customary life, and it is necessarily the object of an intransigent faith. That is what I am describing as the peculiarly poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. And so it's in this context that we should see this operation of the elites that I've described, in which they are or present themselves as value creators rather than as rent seekers. They must take a productivist direction against the rent-seeking part of the elites, and in the name of this productivist impulse, they must appeal to a broader part of society outside the elite. But they are therefore associating productivism with nationalism. And not just with nationalism in the abstract, with any kind of nationalism, but nationalism in this age, in this circumstance, in which the inherited collective identities tend to be eviscerated in the way that I've just described. And that's what I wanted to say about this first element in the coalitions, or this is the second element, because the first would be the workers who reinterpret their interests and identities to favor the conversion of conventional industry into something else. And the second is these national elites who say, we have to bring our country out of backwardness, the way that Hamilton and his people did it in the early life of the American Republic, and the way in which all late-coming developing countries have done it in modern history, one after the other. And they have done it always by combining in their discourse, in their appeal, the productivist direction with the nationalist direction. And the result, when it is successful, is a growth miracle. So suddenly a nation which was vegetating in slow growth, in inconclusive policies, takes off in some way. And if you look at what lies behind this takeoff, it's some combination like this one that I described between productivism and nationalism. Now, would someone like to make a comment or question about those ideas? So this, let's say this is the second element in the coalition that supports the productivist program. And of course, I have my account of nationalism just now is obviously controversial, but it's also hopeful. It's hopeful in the sense that I'm taking this eviscerated, and I said, poisonous form of nationalism as an accident that happened along the way of this journey in which nations that used to be tribes based on homogeneity, social and cultural, are moving toward becoming experiments in forms of humanity under the protective shield of states. And this accident of the evisceration, resulting in the arousal of the intense desire to be different in the presence of the waning of actual difference is then what I'm taking to be the accident that happens along this journey and describes the special climate in which this struggle within the elite takes place. Some comment about this? Yes.
So I know we haven't gotten to capital yet, but you raised the Meiji Restoration as one of the examples, and the other one I'm thinking of is the introduction of the railroad in India under colonial Britain. So I'm wondering how you can silo some of these developing nations and not consider the implications of where the capital is coming from, because these developing areas would need capital to undergo that productivist transformation, which would inherently bring in other agendas from.
Well, of course, that then answering your observation, your question, requires a thesis about the relation of national capital to foreign capital in these development miracles. So I would say that almost invariably, or let me strengthen that, not almost invariably, invariably, the successful growth miracles have required a priority for national capital over foreign capital at the beginning, and therefore some form of forced saving, both private and public at the outset. So you know that the orthodox economic ideas now are a combination of neo-marginalist economic theory coming from the marginalism of the late 19th century with practical Keynesianism. And Keynes, as he was dumbed down by his American followers, the macroeconomists and so forth. And one of Keynes's theses was that saving is much more the consequence than the cause of growth. And there are all sorts of theoretical reasons for thinking that he was correct in a certain way. But his thesis about the relation of saving to growth, saving being more the consequence than the cause of growth, does not take into account the strategic difficulties of beginning a development process. So at the beginning, a development process, one of these growth miracles, requires rebellion against the interests and ideas of finance, of world finance. And there has to be a buffer, a protection against the pressure of that orthodoxy or pseudo-orthodoxy. So this became very clear in the second half of the 20th century when you compare how the Northeast Asian economies developed to how and why the Latin American economies failed to develop in a similar way. So the Latin American economies, almost to a T, developed what you could call a functional equivalent to the 19th century gold standard. And the functional equivalent consisted in opening the capital account, foreign capital, allowing the penetration of the national productive system by foreign multinationals very early, and acquiescing in a low level of domestic saving and a high reliance on foreign saving. So that was supposed to be a shortcut, but in fact it delivered them, yes.
Can you just define domestic saving and foreign saving? I'm just not sure what that is.
Foreign saving is foreign capital.
Okay, thank you.
So domestic, it's being saved somewhere else. It's being saved outside of the country. That's why I'm calling it foreign. And so the idea of the Latin Americans was this was a way of binding the state hand and foot so they would be unable to embark on autarkic populist adventurism in its national economic policies. And so the inhibition on the autonomy of the state vis-a-vis foreign capital, rather than being seen as the problem, was seen by the Latin Americans as part of the solution. Now, the Northeast Asian economies did the opposite. They refused to embark on this syndrome of a functional equivalent to the gold standard. They kept their capital account closed. They, at the outset, preferred loan capital to investment in the productive apparatus, which came later. And they privileged sovereign autonomy in the conduct of their national development strategies. So that's a completely different idea. Now, it's confusing for the following reason, that at the surface, this insistence on forcing a high level of domestic, private, and public saving seems to converge with financial orthodoxy. So part of the financial orthodoxy says you must save, or you must have a surplus, a trade surplus, a capital surplus, and so forth, in order to win financial confidence, the confidence of the financial markets. And the confidence of the financial markets will in turn generate investment and growth. That was the orthodox theory. So this theory mimics that in its temporary outward effect, but for the opposite reason. It says the reason why we need to have a surplus and force a heightening of the level of saving is not to win financial confidence. It's exactly the opposite. So we do what seems to be the same thing for the opposite reason. We want a high level of domestic saving so that our state, our government, and our people will not be on their knees before foreign capital, and will therefore be able to undertake an audacious, rebellious project of national development. And that's what they did. And then what I say is that the proof is in the pudding, in the results. So Latin America is the part of the world economy that suffered in the late 20th century the most catastrophic decline in its relative participation in world product. And the ultimate reason for this decline was its submission to this orthodoxy. It produced no growth miracle. It didn't undertake these rebellious strategies. And what's the lesson? The lesson is that in history, rebellion doesn't always pay, but obedience is invariably punished. And that's what we see in this comparative experience of these two parts of the world. Yes?
Yes, I want to ask about the contemporary nationalism that you're talking about. So taking the example of Tokyo, Japan, and the way the samurai class divested itself of its own privileges for the productivity of under the garb of nationalism or a nationalist take. So is that one categorical thing, or in this project even things could flip between two classes or two factions of the elites, one being the progressive and the other being the highly charged nationalistic faction, and they can flip-flop their powers, centers of powers, as and where necessary, and sustain each other as well.
So, but what's the conclusion?
The conclusion is, how much are the progressives a part of it?
So I don't think that so just to be clear, a nationalist project is not necessarily a progressive project. But I'm arguing that a progressive project is necessarily a nationalist project in the present organization of the world. So there's an asymmetry in my argument. But what I would say with respect to growth miracles is that every single growth miracle that has happened in modern history has had this configuration that I've described from the beginning. If you abstract only the first one, Britain, and that would be another discussion. The United States, Germany, then the Northeast Asian tiger economies, and then earlier Japan, then China. Every single one of them has had this combination of productivism and nationalism. Each one of them has involved a struggle within the elite of this kind that I've just described, and an appeal beyond the elite. And each one of them has also included an insistence on limiting the early penetration of the national economy by foreign capital. Now I say the early penetration because the temporal sequence is vital. So in the very short term, capital cares about its religion, that is, a genuflection to financial orthodoxy. But in the medium to long term, all it cares about is results. So the Latin Americans kneel at the altar of financial orthodoxy, and they get this very costly portfolio capital at the short term. But when it comes to then investment, risk capital later on, where does the risk capital go? The top of the list is China, which has violated every element in the financial orthodoxy. So in the long term, what counts is the results, the opportunities for gain. It's only in the very short term that this genuflection to financial orthodoxy matters. And all of that simply enhances the case for rebellion, for this operation that I've described as the combination of productivism and nationalism. So let's say the workers reoriented from their institutionally conservative and socially exclusive strategy to a transformative and more solidaristic one, or one element of the coalition. I happen to think it's the least important element, but it is one element. The workers who have been working in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, the workers who were the labor force in the import substituting industry that was established in countries like Brazil or India in the middle of the 20th century. So they're one element of the coalition. The second, more important element of the coalition are these rebellious elites who turn against the rentiers, the rent seeker, embrace a productivist project, not necessarily this one that I described, but some productivist project, and associate themselves with the cause of national empowerment and national autonomy. That's the second element in the coalition. And the third element in the coalition is what I want to call the petty bourgeoisie, the subjective petty bourgeoisie. And this was a theme that I began to bring up in the last class, last week, and I now return to it. So this is very important and very mysterious. So in many countries around the world, including the most populous countries, the majority of people are poor, they remain poor, and they're amorphous, they're disorganized. Now, take my country, Brazil. Half of the labor force is in the informal economy. In a country like India, it's obviously much more than that, 90% or something. So half are in the informal economy, working in the shadows illegally, without any protection or economic organization, other than the religious organizations, for example, the communitarian organizations. And in the formal economy, an increasing part of the labor force is in precarious, unstable employment. So that's what we call the secondary part of the labor market. So if you add up the half that is in the informal economy with the increasing proportion in the formal economy that are precarious rather than stable, that's the vast majority of the labor force. That's the fundamental reality of the country. And this mass of people who remain poor, a significant part of them have converted to the petty bourgeois aspirations of self-help and initiative. So in Brazil, we have 50 or 60 million evangelicals, Protestant evangelicals. So the country is ceasing to be Catholic. And the religion of the evangelicals is a theology of prosperity, of self-help, of initiative, of raising themselves up. It's some form of ascent, both spiritual and material. And you could also describe it as a kind of liberalism for the masses. So in a society in which the basic formula of all social relations is some amalgam of exchange, power, and allegiance or affect, that is, it is the sentimentalization of unequal exchange, is the basic formula of social life, endlessly reenacted in the relations between men and women, between parents and children, between bosses and underlings, and so forth. This movement of the small business class and the mass below is in part a secession from that idea. So the idea, it's a way of creating a form of social life characterized by relations of personal responsibility, promise-keeping, seriousness, timeliness, and so forth. Everything that is denied in the traditional formula of social life. And that's why it's a form of spiritual ascent and not just of material ascent. So let's take the Brazilian example. So there's on top, there's a petty bourgeoisie, an objective petty bourgeoisie, a class of small-time entrepreneurs who come from below. They're not like the traditional middle class. They don't focus on the liberal professions, on European culture. They're, in many parts of the country, of mixed race. They're mestizos. And they're focused on this autochthonous entrepreneurialism. And then below them, there are millions of people who are still very poor, but have embraced this culture of self-help and initiative. It's a kind of intermediate group. And then below them, there are the poor masses who are then the beneficiaries and the victims of the transfer programs. And of course, they accept these transfers, these handouts from the state, because they're better than nothing. But they hesitate between entering into this system of being the beneficiaries of co-option and following the example of that new vanguard of the small business class. So that's a Brazilian variation on a worldwide phenomenon. So the worldwide phenomenon is this situation in which the majority is not like the majority as described in the Communist Manifesto. It's not an industrial proletariat. The majority are what you could call the subjective petty bourgeoisie. They're poor, and they have this aspiration to ascent. And the default vehicle of this aspiration, because there's no other vehicle that's presented to them, is traditional, isolated, archaic, retrograde family business. So it's to have a little plot of land, to have a little shop, a store. That's what they gravitate to in the absence of another way of responding to their aspirations. So that's the predominant situation in the world, in the whole world, with the exception of maybe of the richest countries. And I don't know to what extent the United States is an exception to this picture that I've just drawn or not. But the predominant situation is this one, in which most people in most countries in the whole world are these poor people who have assimilated some part of this consciousness of the petty bourgeois entrepreneurial class. And that must be a third element in the coalition that would have to be brought to support a productivist alternative, because that's the only way that the productivist alternative could become real. So in other words, what I'm arguing is that the conversion of the traditional labor force, headquartered in conventional industry, is less important than the association of this rebellious part of the national elite with the subjective petty bourgeoisie. Because that's the main force in the society. And if there is to be a transformation, that's where the transformation has to come from. And this isn't a thesis about one country or another country. This is a thesis about the main tendencies in the whole world. So you understand the very important part of this argument, and this relates then to the historical mistakes of the left, which I mentioned earlier in the course. So in the 20th century, in Europe, which was, after all, the home ground of social democracy, the left made a calamitous choice. The left chose to demonize the petty bourgeoisie, the small business class. Then, having been demonized by the left as the source of evil in society, this class then became the mainstay of the Nazi and fascist movements, of the authoritarian regimes of the 20th century. So this was a disaster. Now, the potential of this disaster has been increased, because if we define now the petty bourgeoisie, not objectively by relative prosperity, but subjectively by conversion to this form of consciousness, I'm claiming this is the majority of humanity. So it would be a total disaster to repeat the same mistake that they made in the 20th century. And so now the question is this: can the progressives find a way of offering what I'd call the subjective petty bourgeoisie a different way of achieving their aspirations? In other words, achieving their aspirations in a form that isn't exclusively the form of archaic, regressive, independent family property. A broader menu of options by which they can rise to relative prosperity and independence and rebel against this sentimentalization of unequal exchange, which has been the characteristic formula of social life. So that then becomes a vital question. It's both a programmatic question and a strategic question. And it involves, and it can't be resolved simply in political economy or in national politics narrowly construed. It involves a whole spiritual struggle as well in the life of these nations. So would someone, yes?
So, on the if the left ever has to propose to the petty bourgeoisie an alternative way that they could attain whatever they want to through their family business, it seems like an essential part of that proposal would have to be demonizing the ill effects of family business without demonizing...
Demonizing which?
Like demonizing the ill effects of family business without demonizing the owners of the family business itself.
Well, of course, the traditional activities of the petty bourgeoisie, family entrepreneurship, family scale entrepreneurship, are based, let's just look at it financially, what it's based on. It's based on two things, on family saving and self-exploitation. So in these family businesses, people work often round the clock. That's what I'm calling self-exploitation. So who are they exploiting? They're exploiting themselves or the members of their own family. And this is a characteristic of this form of life. But it's not economically progressive. It doesn't have a potential because it doesn't have any kind of high technology, advanced practice, knowledge, scale. How is it going to achieve scale? Now, in the early 19th century, in the organization of agriculture, as I suggested early, the Americans had a kind of solution to this in agriculture, because this was the solution of the partnership of the government with the local producer to lift him up so he wouldn't be primitive, and then horizontally among the small-scale producers, cooperative competition. They would be independent proprietors and entrepreneurs, but at the same time they would pool resources and achieve economies of scale. So, for example, they would, if they had agricultural instruments or even machines later on, they would share them. They would share their silos. They would share labor because they would work on one another's land at harvest time. And this was all a form of the pooling of resources to deal with the initial objective problem of petty commodity production, which is small scale. And small scale can be to some extent overcome through cooperation. So that's an example of how this problem was understood and addressed in the early 19th century. Now we're 200 years later, but we have it now on a world scale, a different version of the same problem. So it would be necessary to approach this majority that I'm describing as the petty bourgeoisie with a broader menu of economic options. And this menu is always going to involve some element of partnership of the state with the small-scale producer to bring technology, science, advanced practice to that small-scale producer. So what I'm calling an industrial equivalent to 19th century agricultural extension. And it's always going to involve some element of cooperation among these economic agents to compensate for their inadequate scale. Yes?
So the question then is, if the state does facilitate this kind of cooperation, what happens to the class that wants to have their own business and do all of that, but don't have any, let's say they don't have land or they don't have enough capital to start that. So the way that I'm thinking what these cooperatives would do was they would, let's say it's a farm cooperative, they would hire those workers who don't have plots of land for very, very cheap wages.
And then you would have a kind of the development of a kind of dual, a two-class system in which some would be owners and others wouldn't. Of course, there would be all these dangers and problems that would come up along the way. But I think the beginning is having an economic proposal that has a solution, a response to the felt aspirations and interests of that mass, which I'm calling the subjective bourgeoisie. So, for example, remember that I said, in speaking about the deepening and diffusion of the knowledge economy, a large part of the labor force now are individual economic agents who have lost stable connections to business organizations. And I say, the uplift is not just addressed to the small and medium-sized enterprises of the backward parts of production. The uplift is also addressed to these individual economic agents. So we have to go to them and we have to transform them into what I call technologically equipped artisans. So it's not like the old 19th century craft production. It's now like a late 21st century technological equivalent to craft production. But that's just an example among many examples that one might give or formulate of what would be involved. Now, I think that because there's a spiritual dimension in this, it's not just a matter of economic alternatives for this subjective petty bourgeoisie. It's also a matter of their aspirations, of their horizon, of their dreams. So it's much more likely to flourish in the context in which there's some effort to strengthen social cohesion by multiplying the forms of collective action in society. So that is the way in which people from different walks of life, from different social categories or cultural categories, come together to do things that they both want, purpose-driven action of the different. So that's the real basis of social cohesion. It's collective action outside the boundaries of family selfishness. And if there's a movement in society which encourages, supports this collective action, then that greatly strengthens the attempt to go beyond the horizon of the narrowest forms of consumerism, familyism, materialism, which would otherwise be entirely preponderant in the world of the petty bourgeoisie. So this seems to me, this subject, to me it seems an obvious subject, a subject, but it's not theorized. We don't have a view of this. This is, of course, not what traditional leftist theory is about, so we don't have a conception of it. But this is the reality with which we're dealing. Yes.
I'm interested in because some of the sort of modern day rejections of broad stroke industrial policy is that government doesn't know how to pick winners and government shouldn't pick winners. I'm interested in terms of the sort of...
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yes. Generally understood that government can't pick winners. That's a sort of broad sort of rejection of...
That's the old idea of American policy.
Exactly,
the government
yeah.
decides which are the winning sectors a priori.
So how would you think
Well,
about...
first of all, I carefully avoided that formulation of the idea of industrial policy, right? Because remember, in what I described as the first stage of the attempt to deepen and disseminate the knowledge economy, the focus is on broadening the cast of economic agents who have access to productive resources and opportunities. And so that's not a sector by sector choice of which are the sectors which carry the future. Because one would say it's the future which defines what are the future-oriented sectors, not us. Our task is to increase the range of opportunity and access broadly. Then to repackage some of the multi-sectoral technologies so they can be assimilated by this rear guard. That is, we have to present the technologies and the practices in a form which is only slightly beyond the grasp, the reach of these agents. That's the pedagogic standard. Always a little more, but not too much more, because then it becomes unreachable. And then we have to discover experimentally and empirically which of these things works best and disseminate it. Now, to do that, we have to have a large range. So we can't have a unitary trade policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus. We have to have a broad, pluralistic, decentralized range of experiments so that after the fact we can select from this experimental material what works best, which is then, as it were, the logic of the market, radicalized or generalized. So that's the idea. But it's very self-consciously opposed to the traditional conception of industrial policy as picking winners. And the focus is on innovation in the institutional arrangements of the market economy. Now, someone else had an observation here behind? Yes.
I think the part about partnering with government is the one that I'm struggling with, because it seems like it's the petty bourgeois who's asking the government to not be involved, because they've always, it's either taxes or something else which
That's the traditional petty bourgeois preconception about the government.
Yes.
The government is only making things harder,
right.
imposing more constraints, regulations, and so forth. So that's the preconception that has to be changed by some other way of operating. Now, that's why the American experiment in the 19th century is so interesting. The government is there to help. So the government establishes the land-grant colleges. It brings agricultural science to the door of the farmer. That's the basis for his fantastic productivity. It organizes agricultural insurance and crop insurance to secure agriculture against its peculiar combination of price risk and climate risk and so forth. So it's the practice that would change this preconception, and in which the government appears as the enabler, as the empowerer, rather than as the censor who is prohibiting. Yes.
What you're saying makes me think about perhaps what happened during the early portion of COVID and what the US government set up in terms of the PPP loans for small businesses to kind of carry through operations. And I'm curious if you saw that as an example of what collaboration between government and sort of small industry innovation.
Well, I have to think more about that because that's not directly an example of production. That's the administration of a social problem, right? And it is true that so the innovations in production have to do with a series of other innovations. And so I gave a moment ago the example of multiplication of forms of collective action. But another thing that's related to this is the way in which social services are provided, public services. So I said, all we have in the world up to now by way of provision of public services is what I call administrative Fordism. That is, it's the provision of standardized, relatively low quality services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And then my argument was the state should continue to provide the floor, the universal floor of public services. There should always be a public option. And the state should also operate at the ceiling in the development of the costliest and most advanced public services. But in the broad middle range between the floor and the ceiling, the state should partner with independent civil society in the competitive and cooperative provision of public services, not for profit. It's not the privatization of public services. So in a society in which civil society is directly engaged in the building of its own future by partnering with the state in the provision of public services, it's more likely that this virtuous dialectic between the state and the producer becomes possible, it becomes imaginable. Because there's more stuff in social life that is enacting this lesson. And I think that's what we would have to look for all over. Yes?
Professor, could you speak a little bit more to the role of the elites in this arrangement? I'm struggling to understand what the...
But this isn't an arrangement. Now I'm talking about how, I'm not describing an institutional arrangement. I'm describing how something begins.
Yeah.
In what I call these growth miracles, these national rebellions. And I don't see how a national rebellion is ever possible unless there's some rupture within the national elite. So there has to be people on top who are part of this in some way. Though how that's going to be worked out in the long run is a different matter. And it depends, of course, on, for example, the organization of democracy.
Well, I think it's a different matter in the long run, but it also feels like a different matter in the short run. I mean, by virtue of the fact that they are elites, I would assume that they're doing pretty well under the existing order, and so I'm struggling to understand what their motivation for the rebellious spirit would be in the first place.
Well, I think they're so. Again, it's natural for me to think of my own country, but take and Brazil isn't so different from many other countries in the world in this respect. So, if, for example, you have a situation in which everyone who fails as an entrepreneur or a producer can continue to prosper as a rentier because there is a fail-safe, risk-free form of investment which produces very high interest gains. You know, I put my money in the financial markets. 2 years from now, it doubled. Well, why am I going to be an entrepreneur? So that kind of escape valve has to be closed, and there has to be then some struggle between the rentiers and the producerist interest. So in each circumstance, there will be a specific form that this struggle within the elite will take, and which there won't be an easy way out, and it will matter whether someone is only cutting coupons and collecting the results or has some form of building real value and real wealth. So I think we have to look into the details, but I think the common element, I want to argue, the common element in these national variations across societies will be the association of producerism with nationalism. For a rebellion, for a growth miracle. Let's get out of this.
But it sounds like there has to be some kind of agitation or like a manufactured rupture within that elite.
Agitation within the, of course, plotting, conspiracies, struggles. Yes.
Sorry, but just to follow up on the question, is then the thesis that, well, one possible basis for that rebellion of the elite that is
Rebellion
satisfied
within
with
the
this-
elites, not of the elites.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Within the elites,
Yeah.
they're satisfied as rentiers. Even those who have, a foot in production, they're still rent seeking.
They get by,
and they're
yeah.
well, but they see that the nation could do better if, production was doing better, and that's what's going to create the incentive for conspiracy and rupture and all of that. Is that the sort
No,
of
I
movement
don't
that-
know. I think you're idealizing it beyond what needs to be. So, I think that an industrialist who fails as an industrialist but continues to get by as a rentier could feel that his future is insecure. He's not really building wealth for his own family, for his own dynasty. He's just temporarily prosperous, but he would think this isn't going to go on forever, because why does my country have more than double the real interest rate of every other country in the world? Any modest measure of prudence would suggest that that's not a realistic bet for the future. So I think there's an element of class egoism, which doesn't imply or require any extreme idealization. But I think the nationalist commitment is always essential. So if you go back to the Latin American case, if you have an oligarchy that thinks of itself as we're the men on the shore, we're intermediaries between foreign capital and the national economy. They want to bring money in and exploit our mining and our soybeans, and so we can put things in ships and send it to them. That's a kind of diminishment, a radical diminishment of their horizons, of their ambitions. So if that's the horizon, if that's the attitude, that they're simply, as it were, selling the country in little parts to the foreigner, then the growth miracle can't happen. So without this nationalist element, it hasn't happened anywhere in the world. All right, so unless you have another question or observation, I would then begin what was supposed to have been the main topic today, which was the other parts of this productivist project. And let me go then to the second focal point. So to my mind, they're in a hierarchy of importance. The most important is vanguard and rear guards, the knowledge economy for the many. Then the second most important is labor and capital, and the third down the list is finance and the real economy. So now labor and capital. So the topic is, what is the future of work? And particularly, what is the future of free work? And there are in principle three main forms of free work. They are wage work performed under conditions of economic pressure or necessity. Self-employment, genuine self-employment, not wage work disguised as self-employment, and partnership. And as I mentioned before in the course, up to the middle of the 19th century, there was not the idea that wage work, the buying and selling of labor, was the natural form of free work. The idea was that economically necessary wage work was a deficient form of free work, retaining many of the attributes of serfdom and slavery, and in principle destined to be superseded by the higher forms of free work, self-employment and cooperation. So, for example, if you read Abraham Lincoln's address to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society a few years before the Civil War, this was the topic. No one would be a wage worker if he could avoid it. It's only through folly, improvidence, laziness, you end up as a wage worker. Everyone is something else, is self-employed or partnered, because this was the reality of the United States in the early 20th century. 4 in 5 white men work for themselves rather than for another white man. So there was slavery. There was a slave economy in the South with free trade dominated by Britain. But the economy of the North was an economy of artisans, of craftsmen and small-scale proprietors, of objective petty bourgeoisie, rather than this division between a small objective petty bourgeoisie and a huge subjective petty bourgeoisie. So the liberals and socialists thought a prosperous and free market economy will naturally and necessarily evolve towards an economy based on the higher forms of free labor, which are self-employment and cooperation. But the liberals and socialists of the 19th century were not able to solve the crucial problem. And the crucial problem is how this predominance of the higher forms, self-employment and cooperation, could be reconciled with the relentless imperative of economies of scale, the aggregation of resources, including human resources, labor, in large scale, required by an advanced economy. And then the emergence of the corporate form, and then the assembly of a stable labor force of wage workers under the aegis of the large corporation became the default basic form of free work. And we come to think of self-employment and cooperation as anomalies, as exceptions. That only happened at the end of the 19th century. So it's a relatively, surprisingly, a relatively recent development in our ideas about work. Now, there are two main discourses about labor, about work in the world today. There's the syndicalist discourse of the leaders of the unions, and a substantial part of traditional social democracy, which wants to outlaw all forms of unstable or temporary employment as illegal, as a fraudulent circumvention of the labor laws. And the other discourse is the neoliberal discourse, which under the slogan, the mantra of flexibility, in fact wants to consign the major part of the labor force to radical economic insecurity. Now, the syndicalist discourse is very much in the interest of the organized minority of the labor force. But it's not in the interest of the organized majority of the labor force, who are excluded from this, as in a Brazilian example I just gave. And then the neoliberal discourse says we need total flexibility in the labor markets for the sake of economic performance, and then we'll correct the results after the fact through compensatory and retrospective redistribution. So that's social democracy hollowed out in the way in which it characteristically has been, and redubbed social liberalism. And I want to say both of these discourses are unacceptable, because we can't just, by decree, suppress the new practices and relations of production. It won't work. But that doesn't mean that we should acquiesce in the abandonment of the predominant part of the labor force to radical economic insecurity and in the consequent cheapening of the wage. So there has to be an alternative. Now, in thinking about that alternative, we have to distinguish between two parts of the labor market, the organized part and the disorganized part. The disorganized part now, in most countries in the world, is vastly greater than the organized part. But I still want to say something about the organized part. The organized part is where there's stable labor, assembled still in large units, and there's still unionization. Now, unionization now is minimal in most countries in the world. It basically survives in a country like the United States in public employment and in nonprofits. It doesn't really exist in private business. And so we have to have first a solution for the organized part. Now, I'm going to describe what I think is a solution. I began to describe it last week. But I have to say that I think it's too late, because this part of the economy has now been diminished to such an extent that the historical period in which this alternative that I'm going to defend could be implemented probably no longer exists. It's for a vanished world. But I'm going to describe it nevertheless, because who knows? So in the 20th century, as I began to argue last week, there were two main labor law regimes in the world. The dominant one was collective bargaining, the contractualist labor law regime, established in Western Europe, in the United States, and in outposts around the world. And then there was the other labor law regime, which was the corporatist labor law regime, initially inspired by the Italian Carta del Lavoro of 1927, and widely imitated in Latin America by industrializing left-leaning governments in the 1940s, especially in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. And now I want to say a word about each of these two regimes in order to support my proposal. So the contractualist labor law regime is based on two principles. The first principle is that unionization is voluntary. So it's like a contract. It's an example of freedom to contract, although it's collective. And the workers decide or not whether to unionize within the framework established by the law. The second principle is that the union, once established or if established by the workers, is completely independent from the state. So the theory of collective bargaining is a theory designed to reestablish the reality of contract in the conditions of starkly unequal bargaining power that exists in the employment relation. So the idea was the inequality of bargaining power is so great that in the absence of some antidote, contract will be a sham. That will be in the form of a contract, but it won't really be a contract. The reality of contract will be vitiated by economic duress. And so we will reestablish the equality of bargaining power by allowing the workers to organize. That's the theory of collective bargaining. The economic logic and social logic of the contractualist system is the following. First, the struggle of the worker is predominantly focused on unionizing and maintaining the union alive. So it's like Sisyphus, constantly rolling up, and the rock rolls up the hill, it rolls down again. It takes a huge part of the effort of labor militancy just to unionize and to keep unionized. Then the second element of the logic is that in these economies in which there is a hierarchical segmentation of the production system, the union system tends to reflect and to reinforce the underlying structural inequalities of the production system. And the reason for that is the following. In the capital-intensive, advanced parts of the production system, the workers, to a considerable extent, have common interests with the employers. The wage bill is a relatively small part of the funding of production, and they have common interests in making common cause against everyone else in the economy, including the workers who are employed in the less capital-intensive parts of production. And then, of course, everyone else is down the hierarchy. So what happens in this contractualist system is that it amplifies these underlying inequalities. In these advanced parts of the production system, the workers tend to be in collusion with their employers. They have these common interests. And in the poorer parts, the workers are much more inclined to conflict, but they have much less of an economic basis on which to conflict. The third part of the economic logic of the contractualist regime is that the contractualist regime tends to tilt the focus of the labor demands toward purely economistic themes, wages and benefits, and away from broader political and economic questions. For all these same reasons. Now then, what's the alternative? The alternative in the 20th century was the corporatist regime, especially as established not initially in fascist Italy, but later in Latin America. And the corporatist regime was based on two principles that were the opposite of the contractualist principles. So the first was everyone is automatically unionized. Unionization is like citizenship. Just as you're automatically a voter, you may even have to vote by requirement of law, mandatory voting. You're automatically unionized according to your place in the production system. So, chemical industry has a union throughout the country, and then that's combined with territorial principles. So the sectoral principles are predominant, and then subordinate to that, they're territorial principles. Everyone is unionized. The union is then a gift of the law. You don't have to fight to be unionized. So you don't have all that problems of the Sisyphus trying to unionize to maintain the union. The union is the point of departure. It's not the point of arrival. And because everyone is unionized, there is a natural solidaristic tilt in this union system, rather than the reinforcement of the underlying inequalities that I attributed to the contractualist labor law regime. And everyone is unionized, and then and here comes the second principle, and this is what makes it corporatist. The union is a device of controlled mass mobilization. So these populist dictators like Vargas and Perón established a system as a way of building their own constituency, which is the organized industrial labor force headquartered in the import substituting industries that they had created. And then, so they then create the industry, the sector, and then they evoke the life of the social agent, who then becomes the core of their political support. So the union is a quasi-state organization. It's parastatal, and it's guided by the state acting through the Ministry of Labor. Now then, what's the proposal? The proposal is to say it's very simple. In order to prevent the noxious consequences of the contractualist system, which I just described, those three elements of its logic, we'll take the first element from the corporatist system. Everyone will automatically be unionized. But we'll take the second element from the contractualist system. We'll say the unions will be completely independent from the state. So there can be struggles within the union movement, the labor movement nationwide, and these different movements within labor can be affiliated or not to political parties, and they'll compete for position in the unitary structure of labor, just as political parties in a democratic state compete for position in the state. And so there'll be democracy, but there'll be general unionization. That's the hybrid model, which has begun to be developed in some of the Latin American countries. But one might say now it's too late, because there's a powerful element of contingency, of historical sequence. So this would be the model, but the world for which this might be the model may no longer exist. That's what I'm saying, is we would be the solution for the organized sector. This would be the best solution. I think it would be the best solution everywhere, even in the United States and Europe and so forth. But I have no hope that this will be the solution, because I think this is not. Do you understand the basic logic of the system that I'm describing? Everyone is unionized automatically. So you have a form of representation. But this representation is totally independent from the state. So then you're going to have movements with different ideological tendencies, different political affinities, party political affinities even, and they're going to compete for position by these elections that take place. And so it'll be unified or it won't be unified according to what the workers defend. They'll have a form of representation. The entrepreneurs, after all, are organized in their industrial associations, sector by sector. Why shouldn't the workers be organized on a national basis? And they'll have a powerful institutional vehicle for the representation and expression of their interests. That's the hybrid model that I'm imagining. Now, what about the other part of this puzzle? That's the unorganized part. That's much more important, because that's now the predominant part of labor, the secondary part of the labor market. And the emergency problem is the problem of precarious labor, the so-called precariat. Temporary labor contracts, 0-hour labor contracts, labor contracts without guarantees, In the advanced economies, that's now an increasing part of the labor force. In the developing countries, there's the combination of informality with precariousness. So precariousness in the formal economy, and then, but the majority or half of the country is in the informal economy or more. And so you sum up the informal half with the growing percentage of the formal economy, which is precarious, and that's the vast preponderance of the labor force. And the practical consequence is a downward tilt to the returns to labor. So it creates an adverse situation for labor, leading typically to the cumulative cheapening of the wage. Now, the downward tilt to labor is also incompatible with a sustained rise in productivity or innovation. For a very simple reason. Where labor is very cheap, there won't be technological innovation. There's not technological innovation in a slave economy. And this is like an evocation or a diluted version of a slave economy. So then we have this problem. The problem is that we can't have the 20th century solution for this 21st century problem. The rise of the insular knowledge economy is associated with the predominance of precarious labor, the secondary unstable part of the labor market. We need a different legal regime to deal with this new reality. We can't just outlaw it. That's the syndicalist discourse. We'll say, we'll prohibit it. It's a fraudulent circumvention of the labor laws, decreeing the illegality of this new form of production. But we can't accept the neoliberal acquiescence in radical economic insecurity as the inevitable consequence of flexibility. So we need a way to separate legitimate flexibility from illegitimate insecurity or the cheapening of the wage. Now you can imagine a kind of sliding scale in which you say, we will attempt, using the new information and communication technologies, to organize and represent labor in the secondary labor market. But to the extent that we fail, to the extent that labor in the secondary labor market is not adequately organized and represented, there will be direct legal intervention in the employment relation to prevent flexibility from turning into insecurity and cheapening of the wage. And an initial principle by which we might affirm this idea is the principle of price neutrality that I began to describe last week. We will say labor rendered under conditions of unstable or temporary employment will have to be remunerated at levels comparable to the level of the similar labor undertaken under conditions of stable employment. So in other words, the legal framework of the employment relation, whether it's stable or unstable, will not be allowed to turn into a pretext for the cheapening of the wage. That's an example of the principles that we would have in this alternative legal arrangement. And you could say that, for example, the Scandinavians or the Dutch have through their system of so-called flex security an example of how they attempt to have combined protection with flexibility. So they say the guarantees of the worker are universally portable and not dependent on the possession of a particular job. That's why they call it flex security. And in a way, this legal regime that I'm imagining would have to be the generalization or the flexibilization or the radicalization of the same underlying idea in the Scandinavian flex security. So let's say that's the first stage in the evolution of a treatment of this emergency problem, the problem of precarious labor. Then The second stage, the second step, is a redirection under the influence and the authority of the state of the evolution of technology. So the underlying thesis is that technology has no imminent evolutionary logic. Technology in and of itself does not develop in one or another direction. The direction that it takes depends on the institutional context in which it operates and on the incentives and disincentives that arise from that context. So the state will have an interest in this second stage in influencing the development of technology so that technology doesn't simply replace labor. Technology also, to a significant extent, enhances labor. We go back to the idea, the machine, that idea that I evoked much earlier in the course. When we've learned how to repeat, we express in a formula or an algorithm. Then we embody the formula or an algorithm in the device. The device is to do for us everything that we've learned how to repeat so that we can preserve our time for the not yet repeatable. And then the combination of the machine and the anti-machine being the human being with imagination, is much more powerful than the machine or the anti-machine alone. And the interest of the state is to guide the development of technology in that direction. So to some extent, technology will always replace labor, to some extent. But it shouldn't just replace labor, it should also enhance labor. And we have a special interest in the promotion of the technologies that empower labor rather than simply replacing it. And that's how, for example, we would use additive manufacturing, 3D printers, how we would use robots, how we would use artificial intelligence in general. And their effect would go down even to the most rudimentary forms of labor. Like, for example, the shelf stackers in supermarket chains or in drugstore chains would work with these devices to make their work less burdensome and less formulaic. Operating through these devices which they would have at their disposal. So let's say that's the second stage. And then the third stage, inevitably, has to do with innovations in the property regime, in the regime of private law. So remember the claim that from a legal standpoint, the characteristic of the social democratic settlement of the mid-20th century is that it superimposed it superimposed a new body of public law, the public law of a regulatory and redistributive state, on a largely untransformed body of private law, the law of contract and property and of corporate association. And now we would have to go into private law and innovate in the property regime itself. And that takes us to my thought experiment of the trusts of the capitalism without capitalists, as we say, productive assets of society, rather than being given to the government, which then allocates it by discretionary allocation, is vested in these independent trusts. And we begin to experiment with different regimes in which the productive assets of society, liquid capital and technology, can be auctioned off to the highest bidder, to groups of technologists and entrepreneurs who can ensure the trust of the highest rate of return over a variety of time horizons. So we don't know how this will work, so we have a range. We say, we'll keep absolute private property. It has its use, as I said before. It allows someone to do something that no one else believes in. But it won't be the only way in which we organize economic decentralization. We'll have another set of ways, and we'll do what we're supposed to do, which is instead of being dogmatic and saying this is the way to do it, that's the way to do it, we'll find out what works and how it works. And the democratic institutions will then observe the empirical and experimental record produced by these different trusts and decide what to develop, what to close off, what to abandon, and so forth. That's how we'll do it. And this is the only direction in which we could solve that unsolved problem of the liberals and socialists of the 19th century. Remember, they didn't have a way of showing how you could combine self-employment and cooperation with economies of scale. The only way would have been innovation in the regimes of property and contract, which is what they didn't imagine. So it's interesting now looking back at these proposals to say, so for the proposals for the organized market I'm saying those seem to me the best proposals. But it's probably too late for them. So the train has gone by, the moment has passed. It's for a vanished world. Other proposals, like the third moment of my radical, the moment hasn't come yet, that's too far in the future. So there's a whole range here of ways in which we could meet these problems. But the fundamental theme is the freedom of free work. And that goes back to this idea, which I introduced very early in the course, of freedom in the economy as distinguished from freedom from the economy. So remember, Marx, in the introduction to the critique of the Gotha program, and Keynes in his essay on economic possibilities for our grandchildren, both took the position that we're on the eve of overcoming scarcity. When we overcome scarcity, we'll be able to free ourselves from the hateful burden of work by economic necessity. And according to them, work which we have to perform is always evil. What we want is leisure to pursue the sublime, the private sublime, our hobbies, our diversions, and not to be tied to the wheel of production. So I want to argue both these ideas are false, that Keynes and Marx share. It's false that we're on the eve of overcoming scarcity. We're not even close, and we may never get there, because scarcity is endlessly reproduced in new forms. But it's also not true that work is necessarily just a hateful burden. And we can hope to achieve freedom, not just from the economy, but in the economy. And that turns on these concrete questions, like what is free work? What is the legal framework of free work? What is the relation of work to technology? For example, should a human being ever be condemned to do the work that a machine could do? Say, the principle should be no human being should ever have to do the work that could be done by a machine. Because if it can be done by a machine, it's repetitious, formulaic work that should be unworthy and inappropriate for a human being. The human being should be a partner of the machine. But unlike those workers who worked in Adam Smith's pin factory or Henry Ford's assembly line, he shouldn't work as if he were a machine. And of course, we're very far from that ideal, but that would be the direction in which we would seek to go under this idea. So that's what I want to say about labor, about the problem of labor. And again, your questions and comments, please. Yes?
How do your scenarios change in a world of decreasing population?
How do?
This labor, the relation of labor and capital, change in a world of decreasing population? If, less and less people...
I'm sorry, you have to speak louder because you're far away from
Sorry.
that.
How does your scenario change in a world of decreasing population? Because that's where
Of
we are.
declining population, you say?
Yes.
Well, I don't know whether declining population is good or bad. But how do you think it affects this?
Does not have to work at all. That's how I was seeing it. A future where you will not have to work at all because you will have surplus enough.
You will have what?
There will be enough surplus and people will not have to work at all.
But what's your thesis? The declining population makes work less necessary or makes it more necessary?
Less necessary.
But why? Because why? Because there are fewer mouths to feed, or what? Well, I don't know. That depends on how one views this thesis of the overcoming of scarcity. Our desires are unlimited, and many of them are relative desires. Our desires are mimetic. We desire what other people want just because other people want it. Our desires are empty. They have this projected quality. We desire something because it stands as a proxy for something else. So Robinson Crusoe on his island accumulates things because the accumulation of things is an alternative to dependence on people. So what he really desires is company, but because he can't have company, he has to have things, and so forth. So this is unlimited. I don't see any limitation in that, being given who we are. Yes.
So I understand the duality you're making with humans and machines, how humans can innovate and then machines will take over the manual tasks. But what role do you see things like machine learning playing in that? To what extent could that
I think
possibly
so. Of
supplant
course,
humans?
there's a question of how far machines can go, right?
Yes.
Because
essentially.
after all, now there's a debate about. So I said a machine is the embodiment of an algorithm or a formula, but we now have machines that can go directly from complex data to an operation without passing through an intermediate level of rules of inference. So for example, the machines that have begun to translate natural languages apparently don't need to rely on an intermediate level of rules of inference, like the rules of grammar. They go directly from a complex data set to the results. So there are all these things. So what does this mean? This means that the range of what a machine can do extends further and further out. And our vocation then, on this view, is always to run ahead of the machines. So we're what the machines can't yet do. And we might think that we have the attribute that we have that the machines don't have is imagination. So we can build into the machines an element of randomness, a stochastic element, as well as an inferential element. But what we have is this ability to distance ourselves from the phenomenon, to subsume it under a range of possibles in the domain of the adjacent possible, to recombine everything with everything else in order, and then to discover something, and then retrospectively to formulate the methods and the presuppositions that make sense of what we've discovered. That's what we call the imagination. Now, how far can machines penetrate into this domain of the imagination? Because I'm saying we have imagination, they don't, but maybe I'm mistaken. And some part of this realm that I'm calling the imagination, the machines could also acquire. And if that's true, then we would have to be projected forward to what they don't yet have. So it's, on this view, the machines are like the petrified versions of what we were. And of ourselves, we have to say that our principle is, you haven't seen anything yet. So we represent the future. That's the idea. And so if we know how to do it, we shouldn't be doing it as if we were a machine. We should be doing only the things that we don't yet know how to do and that require some other capability. But I agree. This is subject to challenge in the light of technological evolution. So what the machines can become, how much of these attributed powers of ours could in fact be achieved mechanically, is something about which it would be foolish to make a priori statements. So it's open. But at a given time in history, I would still want to defend my principle. No human being should be condemned to do something that a machine at that time could do. It's not that he should be liberated from the need to do something that at some future time a machine might be able to do. Because we ascend collectively in historical time ahead of the machines. That's the ideal that animates this conception.
Thank you.
All right, so we have one more subject of the productivist agenda to discuss, which is finance and the real economy, before we go on to democracy. So the productivist project has to do with the democratization of the market order. The counterpart to the democratization of the market order is the deepening of democracy. So we're going to finish the productivist project. We're going to go on to democracy. Then there's a third domain, which is the formation of the agent, the defiant agent, the citizen, the worker, and his education, and be capable of producing him. Continue now.